All righty, welcome back, fellow dissidents. We have again with us Marquis, Mr. Marquis. I got your name right this time. And today we're going to go over the omnibus spending bill because what are libertarians good for other than critiquing government for their theft? And so we got the Rand Paul pulled up the Festivus report that just dropped. So we're gonna go through that. So how are you feeling tonight, Mr. Marquis?
Yeah, thanks for having me on again. This is really quite a mess. Over the past fiscal year, the government's been spending money on a lot of really absurd things. And if you haven't been paying attention, Rand Paul every year compiles a huge list of stuff that the government shouldn't be doing, but they're doing anyway. And they're spending millions and billions and even hundreds of billions of dollars doing it. Waste has been like holding steady at around $50 billion the way he calculates it just year over year. But this year, for some reason, it's shooting up meteorically. I'm pretty sure this has got to do with COVID aid and specifically the PPP loans, the Paycheck Protection Program loans, the ones that were used to buy like Lamborghinis and shit. But it's just ridiculous. Why don't you get started with it?
All righty, so let's see here. Let's get this switched over. Get us both up here. All right. So we got the Festivus pulled up here, and we'll switch it over to me real quick. There we go. All right. So this is just the table of contents that gives you the overview of the waste from the previous year. And it looks like the largest number goes to interest payments on debt. That's the treasury. That's where the government just literally makes money printer go burr and pays for treasury debt. And then you've got among that, you got maintaining 77,000 empty federal buildings. These are government buildings that are maintained for absolutely no reason other than to steal money from you. And this is probably part of the larger money laundering operation that they have. They have all of these things on paper, but more than likely it's going to bureaucrats' pockets and not to maintain any kind of building. Let's see, what are some of the more ridiculous ones? You got giving ineligible citizens COVID economic injury disaster grants. These are SBA grants. There was $4.5 billion for that. You got using COVID relief funds to construct an 11,000 square foot spa because the oligarchs got to have they got to get their sauna on. You got COVID relief funds to purchase luxury cars. That's $31.5 million. You got Wisconsin school using COVID relief funds to upgrade turf fields. You got to play football, of course, during COVID when you're not even supposed to be around each other, supposedly. Camouflage uniforms that do not fit the Afghanistan environment, the Department of Defense. We love them. Funding a 1.5 mile park in Austin, Texas, used for yoga and concerts. Liberals love their yoga. This one gets me right here. Starbucks espresso machines for the Department of Defense. They spent almost $200,000 for the oligarchs to have their espressos and lattes. This is absurd. What else we got? We got the interest payments. That was one of the largest ones. You got maintaining the buildings. That's the next largest one. Basic education, in quotation, projects in Jordan, of course, because, foreign aid, we most certainly do have Republican socialists. It's just for foreign aid and Zionists and things of this nature. What else we got? Expanding the Washington, D.C. streetcar that's rarely used and unreliable. It says expanding the Washington, D.C. streetcar, and that is with $175 million, helping illegal immigrants avoid deportation. The Biden policy, open borders. I'm just gonna stop right there. I want to get your insight on there's a large rift in the libertarian sphere over border policy. The way I see it is something similar to Dave Smith, whereas if we had our ideal Ancapistan or whatever, or even just some type of functioning government who does what it does, they would be protecting person and property. Now, you would be obviously the entire border. It wouldn't be necessarily a border. It would just be a collection of properties. and those people would be allowing people to pass through or be on their property as they see fit because it's their property. You know, the entire libertarian theory is derived from inherent right to yourself and inherent right in your property, right? So the way I would see it is that there wouldn't, at a minimum, because we live in reality with a government, that they should at least be protecting the borders because this is in fact our property. It should be in some way maintained in that aspect. I don't see it as because it's government property, we all own it in communion and should share it equally. That's a very socialist way to look at it in my aspect. It's not as if we're saying that a heroin junkie can go into the elementary school whenever he wants because it's a government building. Of course, that's a ridiculous standard. So why would we hold the same standard for the border? What are your thoughts on the border?
I think that's pretty much correct. A lot of my thoughts on immigration can basically be summed up by what Hans Hoppe wrote about the topic, and that in a society that's run by private property and not some socialist Santa Claus state, there won't be immigration as an idea. You're either going on a property or you're not going on it. There can't be a right of free immigration into a society where there is no public property. So right there, that would be in like some Ancapistan world, there wouldn't be immigration at all. You're either going on private property or not, and the private property owners are the ones who are deciding that, not some government body. In reality, this looks like homeowners associations being able to decide if people are able to rent property there, or city chambers of commerce being able to tell people who and what can open up a business there, like what type of business and such. And that's essentially what it looks like. There's a nihilistic current in a lot of libertarian thought that is very depressing to look at. People say that just because as people have some sort of freedom that they can go into a library because it's a library, and a hobo can shoot up cocaine in the bathroom or do something like that, and it's his liberty to do that, and we mustn't impugn the liberty of the bums to make everyone else's life terrible, and we mustn't keep people from doing antisocial behavior. That would be some sort of totalitarian thing. No. If we're going to have a government at all, it should be protecting people from flagrant antisocial behavior, at bare minimum, on government property. If we're going to admit that government property exists, we should at least keep it nice. We should at least keep it from being turned into a third world country like San Francisco is. And speaking of San Francisco, I always have to bring this up because of just something I said in a different podcast. San Francisco is currently building a $1.6 million public bathroom, but I digress. This is actually the third one that they've done, all in Nancy Pelosi's district, but that's just how it works when you allow the homeless to take over. But
sure. Yeah. So I would I would agree with basically everything that you said. I would offer a little bit of pushback as as for the standard, in my view, I would say that we got to make sure that we're not having a moralistic viewpoint of said government property. Now, a lot of people are very they critique Rothbard on his "Sick the Police" article, his later work in his paleo years. He said that you should, in fact, on public parks and such, if there's homeless about, that you should use the police to get them out of there because that's it's public property. But he was coming from the more private property rights, and if we're gonna have a government type stuff, that we need to at least maintain it in this way. We just have to avoid the liberal fallacy of the slippery slope in bringing our morals into it. That's just the only little bit of pushback. Other than that, I agree 100%. So
right, I think we basically agree on that. I take a lot of my cues from Rothbard, but I spread it out a lot, and like Rothbard, I essentially am a man of the right. Rothbard moved around a little bit, but he always stayed consistent. The only thing he moved around it with was with the people he associated with. Like, in the
exactly.
60s, he was with the anti-war, he was with the left. He talked about the new Black Panther Party, and he talked about a lot of stuff that you wouldn't associate Rothbard with. There was a collection of his articles
Yep.
called A Libertarian Look at the 60s that was really good. But
Yep.
then you compare that to early 90s Rothbard in The Irrepressible Rothbard, that book where
Triple
he
R.
was writing with Lou Rockwell. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's it's a little bit of a different flavor, but he's still got the same principles of liberty. And
Correct.
essentially, I'm going to agree that if we're going to admit that the state is going to exist and for the foreseeable future, I think we're probably stuck with it, which is why I don't go whole hog into anarchism. But
Fair enough.
if we're going to admit the state is here, we can at least make it less terrible. And most public facilities are very terrible. I was on the CTA, the Chicago Transit Authority, last week, and this place is actually a sewer. People actually take a piss on the trains, and you wouldn't be able to get away with that on private property.
You don't like the liberal utopia of dystopia Chicago? No?
No, I can't believe that's part of the same state. There's a secession movement in my state to break Illinois into two states, and I need to get on this. We're going to excommunicate Chicago.
Yeah. Well, if only we could rebrand the secession as, something of a popular movement but what will, this is where I come back to the culture war issue. The left is very good at stringing together a narrative, historically, contemporary, culturally. They have a way of, because they don't have principles, they can abandon their principles at the drop of a hat for their narrative. It's like this House vote. They were saying that the dissenters in the Republican Party was showing how they were fascist. So their narrative that they're stringing together is that real democracy, because I hate democracy. I'm sure we're on the same page there if you're a fan of Hoppe.
Based.
Yeah, it's like they're saying that democracy and anti-authoritarianism is being in lockstep with the mob. It's like you cannot be more illiberal than that. It's like we discussed in the last podcast. They are branded liberals. This is why I commend you on trying to, re-grab Mises in the liberal tradition. This is also why I try to stray away from labels altogether, because it's like me and you are both, and if we went back to 1920, we would be considered radically liberal. But you bring us to today and we're considered far right fascists, right? So this is just all in the same vein of the contemporary liberal narrative making, right? So let's go ahead and continue on here with the Festivus. So we left off about helping immigrant deportation, which was to the tune of 168 million. What else we got here? Mismanaged and untracked fuel purchases, state, that's 77 million. Subsidizing the free New York Staten Island ferry, Department of Transportation, 69 million. East Baton Rouge, unused federal housing grants, boosting the Tunisia travel sector during COVID-19, unused hotel rooms for illegal immigrants. This is back to the open border policy of the Biden administration. And really, there hasn't been any real border policy reform in decades. So it doesn't change much from regime to regime. Like Donald Trump, he was more hard-lined on it, but I have to say that the Biden administration most certainly has a humanitarian crisis at the border at this point. And now it's perfectly exemplified. And this is just what's on paper. This is just what someone who's deep inside the Congress has been able to come up with. Who knows how bad it really gets outside of this, right? All right, so moving on. Constructing a Gandhi museum, because the government needs to steal money from us to foreign aid and such. Where are we at here? Watching hamsters fight on steroids. That would be your boy Tony Fauci, the NIH. $3 million to watch steroided hamsters fight. This is absolutely absurd. Like, I wonder why the regular person this is probably why the regular person doesn't pay attention to the fiscal policy of the government. Like in one sense, it should show you that we need a popular revolution, like obviously peaceful and blah blah blah. But it's like, how is it that we're fighting steroided hamsters and people aren't upset that this money is going to them? Thoughts?
Well, it gets worse than the steroid hamsters. My personal favorite one there was where they actually injected puppies with cocaine. Another Fauci flop, I believe.
Yeah.
Fauci has like a crazy record of like abusing dogs and shit, and the government is actually funding this. Not to mention, we're also funding gain of function tests in Wuhan, but I digress on that one. But yeah, like you were saying, there's just so much insane stuff in here. One of the numbers I take issue with, just from the stuff I've been reading in the press, was that 31 million for COVID luxury relief funds used to purchase luxury cars. From the press and just reading it, it's higher. So technically not wrong, but it is more than 31 million. So there is that. And yeah, they spent 28 million, the DoD did, on camouflage for Afghanistan after we pulled out of Afghanistan. And then you can't even blend in Afghanistan. Get that? I don't get that.
Yeah, no,
It just
it,
goes on.
yeah, it's absolutely absurd. And speaking of Fauci, it looks as though the bottom of the better half of the bottom of this list, these are just the NIH here. You got the fighting hamsters on steroids, NIH. What do we got here? Injecting 6-month-old beagle puppies. That's what you said. Encouraging Ethiopians to wear shoes. Training mice to binge drink alcohol. Using mice to study racial aggression. There's your racial equity in action. That's your praxeological ideologues. And verifying that kids love their pets. Those are just the things that the NIH was funded for. Now, we can't get Tony Fauci to subject himself to inquiries about whether or not he's bought and paid for by the pharmaceutical companies, right? But then we have to elect a radical libertarian or a paleo Republican, whatever you want to call him, Ron Paul's son, to go into Congress to dig this up. And he goes, him and his clerks and all of the people that he works with, they go through and they list all of this. And then it's just people who are deep politicos who care about the actual ramifications of the policies that are enacted by the oligarchs who sit here and pay attention. And this is actually what drove me to want to record and to reach out to folks and to talk about the liberty sphere and praxeology and economics and the actual policies that the government is enacting, because I'm sure you don't need to have a kid to respect the radical degeneration of fiscal policy in this country. But that is where it stemmed from for me. It's like, how do I explain this to my kid? And the deeper and deeper you go down the rabbit hole, the worse and worse it gets.
Yeah, even 10 years ago, it was nothing like this. We weren't spending upwards of what 3.37 trillion was the number that Biden spent in the last calendar year, something around there.
Yeah.
Even just a decade ago, this was completely insane. And just a decade ago, trillion wasn't just a number that we just threw around. Now,
it's not quantifiable. These numbers are not quantifiable.
People don't have an idea of what $1 trillion is. They don't have an idea of what $1 billion is. Most people don't have an idea of what $1 million is. This is just monopoly money to people. This is the rule when you're playing Monopoly, that the bank does not run out of money. It says that in the official rule book. Mm-hmm. It can just print more money. Well, in Monopoly, you're exempt from inflation. You're not exempt from inflation in real life. This is quite a problem. You're also not exempt from essentially mortgaging the tax dollars of future taxpayers by borrowing billions and trillions of dollars. No matter what, if government is getting its money from somewhere, it's taxing it no matter what. There are 3 ways government can get money. taxes just directly. Plain and simple, it's the honest way to do it. Taxes. You vote on it, you pay it. People don't like it. That's why the government doesn't do that much of it. It can also borrow the money, but when it borrows the money, through the interest that's going to have to pay out, you're mortgaging the taxes of the future, because just borrowing the money is only kicking the can down the road. That's not actually raising the money. You're going to have to pay it back with interest.
Yeah,
So
and
that's a non-solution.
this is the radical scam that they're playing on the American people, because if the money printer that creates the money, right? And we've already disconnected it from anything hard, so the inflation is just piling and piling up. Not to mention the way they purchase government bonds to manipulate the interest rates. Put all that to the side. The fact that the money printer has interest. Think about this. So that the government borrows money from the Federal Reserve at interest, but they can only get money from the Federal Reserve at interest. How do you ever pay off the interest? You won't. Eventually, you will have to default. And that's going to eventually fall on the taxpayers of future generations, who will actually create wealth and then be redistributed through, through the government.
The interest on debt is now our fourth largest item and comes to $514 billion right now. But if we use the debt clock time machine and fast forward at current levels, 4 years in the future, it's going to be 1.5 trillion. So it's actually going to triple in the next 4 years.
Yep, I got
that should be extremely concerning. We'll be spending more on that, almost not quite twice as much, but in the neighborhood of twice as much as we will be on the Defense Department, which is completely insane.
Yeah,
that will be our then third largest.
Yeah, and just imagine if to spend 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq and all these the foreign adventurism that our government is engaged in. Imagine if they had to tax people to continue this. It would have been shot down immediately. It's literally through the proxy of the Federal Reserve that these people are able to continue this, because most folks don't understand. People think that inflation is CPI, consumer price inflation. They think it's just prices rising. They don't understand that every time the government just adds zero, they used to have to print the shit. It at least cost something, infinitesimal, but something at least, right? But now they literally just add zeros in, and it degrades your dollar and transfers the wealth up to wherever they want to put it. So they don't have to have their lobbyists. They don't have to have the Congress. They don't have to have anything. They literally just print it, hand it out to their cronies, and continue their adventurism. It's the largest Ponzi scheme ever seen on earth. And it's like only the libertarian sphere is worried about it. This is one of my biggest gripes about the GOP and people who say that Trump or whoever, DeSantis, is going to be the answer to all their problems. It's like, they are socialists as well. Ludwig von Mises famously walked out of a meeting with, it was a talk with Milton Friedman and a bunch of free marketeers, and he got mad because they were, I forget what the discussion was about, but it was essentially, they were discussing I think it was the negative tax policy or something to that effect. And Ludwig von Mises threw up his hands and said, "You guys are all socialists," and walked out. And he wasn't wrong, because all of these people agree with redistributing wealth. It's just however they see fit.
That's exactly a problem. Wasn't that the 1947 meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society? I
Yes,
feel
sir.
like it was.
Yes, sir.
That would do it.
Yeah.
But this is exactly why the 20th century was the bloodiest century in world history, because that was the time when the state finally broke through and monopolized the big banks. Central banking married to the state. And in the United States, the central banking married to the state came the same year as the income tax did, 1913, right before the dramatic expansion of the Navy for the looming war, and right before the dramatic expansion of the military. Somehow we were able to demobilize after World War I. We were even able to demobilize after World War II, but after Korea, there was no demobilization. And if you look at the spending on the military ever since Korea. It never goes back down. And Dr. Robert Higgs, in his book Crisis in Leviathan, tracks the growth of the military-industrial complex, the welfare warfare state, and there's a ratchet, which is where, like, think of the mechanical function of a ratchet. It will always apply force going forward, but unless you reset it, it's not going to go backwards. It's the same for government spending and government power. Once it gets more power, once it spends more, it's going to only augment its power further forward. It's not going to go back. If it goes back a little bit once it's over, it will still be at a higher baseline, and it will then build up from that baseline. But after Korea, it doesn't go back down really at all. It only just keeps going up from there. That's when the military-industrial complex really starts. And after then, the US essentially has precisely the nightmare of the Founding Fathers. We've created a standing army of the exact model that they said enslaved all of Europe. The same kind that was, as even in the Founding Fathers' days, is launching coup d'etats and essentially reducing the people to glorified absolutist serfdom. But I digress. If the 20th century wasn't the zenith of the welfare warfare state, and if it didn't pauperize the world in doing so, then there can be no such example of the creature.
Yeah, correct. And not to mention, the 20th century was the deadliest century in terms of democide in as far as we know in recorded human history. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people who died directly or indirectly by proxy of their governments, and particularly socialist governments, people like Mao Zedong and Lenin and Stalin. You know, and the parallels to today's society are quite eerie when you get into the fact that it's always done with a humanitarian cover. It's always for the greater good of society that these people are doing this, right? It's like the Holodomor. They were saying that they had to take the wheat from the poor Jews and bring it back to the cities, you know, and it's millions of people starved to death, right? And it's like, now you look at it today and it's more implicit. They've gotten a lot better with their propaganda, and they understand that you can't just outright put people in gulags for being thought criminals. But a good example is, look at our neighbors to the north. Have you heard about this story of Jordan B. Peterson? This is why I'm so against licensure and licensing by the state. If you went back to the 1900s and you brought someone forward to today, they would say, where is America? You were allowed to just start a business on a street corner. There was no licensing. There was no regulations for these things. They slowly built up the regulation state and the licensure state to expel anybody from the plebiscite from being able to enter the marketplace. So now you've got weaponized licensure even in Canada, and people are like, oh yeah, that's Canada. It is, but you know, this is another supposed a self-proclaimed liberal democracy, quote unquote, right? And they are now threatening to take away Jordan B. Peterson's license to practice clinical psychology unless he submits himself to re-education, is literally what they call it. Like, this is straight out of 1984. If he has to pay for it, which is like $225 an hour or per session or something like that. He has to go through the entire process of what they call re-education for offending people on Twitter about criticizing government particularly. And then at the end of it, they get to decide whether or not he keeps his license to practice clinical psychology. And, you know, when they look back at history and they see Jordan B. Peterson, they're not going to so much focus on his clinical psychology, although he has done great work there. He's done a lot better things, you know, especially for people like me who grew up without a father and needed that father figure, and, you know, was able to take religious text and convey it to a person who's agnostic in a way that they can grasp and understand, and you know, like, clean up your room. Why are you worried about the world's problems when your room's dirty? Clean that up. then go to your living room, clean up your house, clean up your yard, work on you first. Like this message, this larger message, that's what they're trying to silence. And they do it by way of regulation and licensure of the state.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really liked what you were saying about where is America if we took an American back from the 2 centuries ago and just plopped him down in the middle of New York City today. This country has really gone by the wayside, and the regulatory state is really one of the biggest consequences of that. So when you get right down to it, liberty has to be defined as the absence of coercion, and coercion is that which proceeds from political power. Political power is force. Usually, it's wielded by a state. It doesn't have to be wielded by a state, but say other examples that I call them private users of political power. Sneak peeks of a book I'm writing. An example of that would be the mafia. If you're not using force and you're using, say, the power of persuasion, this is social power. This is an Italian social club. But when the Italian social club starts employing guns and starts forcing people to do things, then this Italian social club becomes the mafia. And essentially, the state has done that. So people condemn the mafia for using force, political power, same thing, to get their ends. They don't condemn the state for doing that, except for a very small number of people who find it objectionable that the state uses a logarithmically larger amount of political power than any other organization in human history ever could have. The old empires of antiquity never would have been able to even imagine this sort of power. This is a power that is completely beyond the conception of a Crassus, a Caesar Augustus, or a Darius or Cyrus. This is completely beyond the imagination of the ancients. This is even beyond the totalitarian dictators of the 20th century. The technology that has been a force multiplier for political power has allowed for oppression to magnify. It's just insane in just how much power the state has, and people don't even discuss it. People don't even discuss that the state, especially our country, our state, which started off as a relatively small state. The War Department used to have 2 employees. When they moved the capital from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., it took 1 horse cart to move all the archives. The payroll, the first spending bill that was passed by Washington, spent the amount of money that we spend in 6 seconds. I did the calculation today. This isn't talked about anymore. This metamorphosis from that small, tiny, commercial, mercantile republic, this Jeffersonian legislator type deal that's off on the periphery of civilization, where people are free to do their own thing, and how it metamorphoses into a state, the likes of which could not have been imagined by the ancients. It couldn't have been imagined by any of the people in the Middle Ages or anyone even in the 20th century.
Yeah, it's
this metamorphosis is insane.
Yeah, and to piggyback on what you were saying about the power of the state and the correlation of the mafia, us anarchists, we often applaud the irony of people who say that anarchism would result in just that. The corporation would take over, or you'd have to be coerced into protection from the mafia. And what that is not actually fear of what anarchism or a market anarchist society would be. It's actually a projection of the status quo. Like, you got people who say, oh, well, what about, excuse me, what about like an anarchist who wants to make a bomb? But they're not worried about the trillions of dollars that we spend to bomb brown people in the Middle East, right? Like, this is just not a thing. Bernie Sanders just killed the Yemen War Powers Act that would have at least brought some accountability and stopped the war in Yemen, right? But they're worried about an anarchist making a bomb if we don't have a government. I mean, it's just absolutely absurd. it's the projection of folks, but bringing it back to the omnibus here. I know you were talking about the luxury vehicles. If you want, I'll pull it up. You can read it and we'll discuss. You got it pulled up there?
Indeed. Scrolling up to it. I've got it on my computer also.
Yeah, I believe it's page 5 is where they discuss.
Right. More than $31 million in COVID-19 relief funds were used to purchase luxury cars. As an addendum, I know for a fact I've seen in the press it's more than 35 million, but I digress. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the United States government has spent nearly $4.55 trillion on relief aid, and unsurprisingly, in December, the United States Secret Service revealed that more than 100 billion of it was stolen from COVID relief programs or considered fraudulent. I believe it's 110, 115 billion, somewhere in there. I read the report. In fact, 4 people managed to use over 31.5 million in COVID relief funds to purchase luxury cars. You've got that right. You helped 4 people, one of them who isn't even a U.S. citizen, purchase luxury cars. I'm talking really expensive vehicles here, Porsches, Ferraris, even Lamborghinis. One managed to purchase a whole, quote, fleet of luxury cars using 17 million. Yes, you read that right, taxpayer dollars, which included a Corvette Stingray, a Porsche Macan, and a Bentley convertible. Of that, the federal government has only recouped 7.2 million. Another man used 5 million in Paycheck Protection Program loans to purchase a Lamborghini and a Ferrari, among other luxury cars. So while many Americans were stuck at home making banana bread and watching Tiger King, these individuals were living it up with the top down and fancy cars, unquote. That's just about right, though. Oh, corruption has always gone hand in hand with the state, because the state, of course, is the realization of what Oppenheimer called the political means. So it's the state is the organization by which you live by stealing other people's shit, essentially. So this is a perfect opportunity for graft and fraud, and this has always been the case with the state. Even when you go back before, like, the revolution of sovereignty in the Middle Ages, and start talking about things like proto-states and things that academics differ on if you're going to call them a state or not. I still call them states, but whatever. Even during feudal times, you're definitely going to see a lot of corruption, graft, and fraud. And I don't know why people are surprised that when you expand suffrage and democratize society and just allow everyone into the system, you're going to get the same kind of corruption that you got under feudal aristocracies, only now everyone can exploit everyone. Friedrich Bastiat, the 19th century brilliant French economist who has gone far too early, wrote in the law that this is the situation where everyone plunders everyone, which is very absurd. In the past, it was only a few people plundering everyone, which, terrible, but only a few people are doing the plundering. Now, everyone is doing the plundering, and it's a helter-skelter race to see who can plunder the most. So, when you have this much incentive and this much opportunity for plunder, there's going to be more plunder in total. And when there's more plunder in total, it's harder to keep track of all of it in total. So, when there's more of it and it's harder to keep track of, you're going to get people buying Lamborghinis, Teslas, Bentleys, and all kinds of other cars with money that was supposed to go to paying, like, grocery baggers and auto technicians, or maybe the odd coder. But instead of paying their wages during a global pandemic that the government voted to spend $4.55 trillion to alleviate the stress of, instead it goes towards people who want to buy a Lamborghini or something. I'm not surprised at this at all, but apparently people are surprised.
Yeah, I don't you know, this is my big gripe with conservatives. The Trump was lauding the omnibus bill in 2020. He was bragging. He was, Trump in his braggadocious manner, talking about, oh, this is the greatest spending package in history. And he even I believe it was Thomas Massey, somebody, he was literally denigrating the only people who were saying, wait, we don't need to spend this much. This is crazy. They're going to print this money out of nowhere. This is not fiscally sound. And he attacked them and, basically did his diatribe of, whatever it is, Trump's little caricature. But it's like, we have amnesia as a species. We can't remember yesterday. And this is why we are where we are. Like, I often hear about I'm socially liberal but fiscally conservative. None of those things are real anymore. Then maybe that was a good fallacy some 20 years ago, but today there is the corruption and the uniparty is so blatantly overt. Like, I don't understand how people can even maintain the mirage that is the federal government. Like, there is, like, this whole thing that's going on with the Speaker of the House. Like, it's all political theater. They're going to, what is the difference between Jeffries and McCarthy besides the D and the R? I honestly don't see the difference. And I know people say that that's satire or it's a hyperbole, but I really don't see the difference. You're going, I don't know. I don't say, if you want to expand on that, I just don't see the difference between the two, especially when it comes to fiscal policy. You can't take a Republican and run a political campaign on going back to Obama. Back to Obama. Just let's roll it back to that. You wouldn't even make it in the political landscape of today.
That's exactly the problem. And the difficulty is that there has been a one-party democracy in this country. That's essentially what it is since the 1890s. Rothbard was writing in his book, The Progressive Era, published posthumously, just a collection of his voluminous essays on this, where essentially when Cleveland went down, the old Democratic Party that actually stood for free trade and stood for America as it was, America as in the land of liberty, the land where you're not going to be coerced by the state, the land where the state is not responsible for you. That dream died 130 years ago as a political idea, as in there hasn't been a party that's been batting for that idea since then. And the Libertarian Party, it's off on the fringes. I'm not talking about that. But the two parties since then have been twiddly-dee and twiddly-dum. There has been no difference since then. Their only difference is that the Republican Party is the Me Too party of big government. They don't push the expansion usually, except when it's to do with the military, but that's a whole nother sack of worms. I've got like half a dozen articles about that in the past month, so that's a whole show, but I digress. It's the Democrats who are first building up the state, but the Republicans will say, we want to build up the state too, but we're going to build it up less. That's why they're able.
It's the famous Michael Malice made it. He put it into the ether that Republicans or conservatives are just progressives driving the speed limit. He's the one who came up with that, and it's absolutely correct. Think about Trump being called. He's called a conservative, like a neoconservative or whatever they want to call him. He's considered to the right of middle, right? He's right to the right of center, but he's been a lifelong Democrat. The same thing with Tulsi Gabbard. She just left the Democratic Party, and she's now endorsing people like Don Bolduc and neocons and things of this nature. It's like all they do is wait 10 years to institute the policies that the Democrats are instituting right now. That's why they call them progressives. They can't stop. They just continuously go and they steamroll over anybody who's not in lockstep. And then you've got the Mitch McConnells of the world saying, well, hold on there, Democrats. And it does nothing. And this is why I don't vote. This is why I take the agorist strategy. I don't see how you maybe in like the Free Staters of New Hampshire, local political action, joining a school board, joining a local committee to see what your local province or town is doing with their fiscal policy, trying to nullify federal laws by local laws. I can see that as a political action, but this demagoguery and mob rule that we have now, is you've literally got the two culture war factions, and you've got one who claims they want a constitutional republic, but they engage in the demagoguery. And then you've got the Democrats and all of their separate factions, but they are in absolute lockstep. They don't want a constitution. They want mob rule, and they basically want to castrate your children.
Essentially, like I said in the last episode, radical devolution. If we're going anywhere, if we're going to keep this place from completely falling apart and going in some crazy, ugly direction where nobody wants to see it at all, literally nobody, then we need to be able to give people what they want. Like the government needs to do what people want. And the best way to do that, in my mind, is to let the people be different. It's stop trying to save everyone. I'm not trying to save everyone. We shouldn't be trying to save the world. We shouldn't even be trying to save the whole country at this point. We should be trying to save what we can save. This means state of Jefferson. This means break Illinois into 2 states. This means greater Idaho. This means let the Californians leave. This means let the Pacific Northwest become Cascadia. Join Canada if they want to. This means let the Texans leave. This means let Arizona divide. We could keep going ad nauseum, ad infinitum, but
yeah, there's
people choose.
Yeah, there's a free ebook by Tom Woods called National Divorce. I highly recommend it to everybody, and you as well. You can get it. It's free, and it's basically it's the radical libertarian perspective on secession, and it's the pragmatic, it's the moral, it's the cultural, it's everything. It's the all encompassing argument for radical secession. And I would advocate everybody take a look at it because it perfectly buttresses your point there. So let's go back here to the Festivus report here. So this is I'll take over this one. You got the most expensive Festivus report here is interested in waste. The Department of Treasury spent 475 billion on interest payments in the fiscal year 2022. Just days before Christmas, the big spenders in Washington jammed through a 1.9 trillion omnibus package for 2023. They released it in the dead of night, allowed for no real debate, and nobody in Washington even read the thing before being asked to vote on it. When this is how Congress funds the government, is it any wonder net interest payments on the debt rose to 475 billion for fiscal 2022? That's right. The federal government shelled out nearly $500 billion on interest on the debt alone. That's money that doesn't buy a pen, paperclip, or provide any sort of utility for Americans. Once you get up to that large of an amount of money, it becomes difficult to visualize. This is what we were discussing. You can't quantify these kind of numbers. So how much money is 475 billion exactly? Well, if you were to count to just 1 billion at a pace of one number per second, it would take you 31 years, 251 days, 7 hours, 46 minutes, and 40 seconds. Now multiply that by 475. It used to be a big deal when Congress spent that much money. When Congress bailed out the banks in 2008, it spent about 700 billion, and that, some argued, was meant to save the entire economy of the United States. Now we're shelling out just about that much without getting a single thing back for it and not blinking an eye. Is it any wonder we're this far in the hole when Congress uses Christmas as a cudgel to pass pork-laden spending bills? This is ultimately this is the degradation of the system at its finest. They've put together I commend Rand Paul and Thomas Massey for trying to coalesce across the aisle with Democrats to put together a bill that at least says, give us 72 hours. That's all we ask. Give us 72 hours so we can at least examine this bill, whatever the bill is, whether it's an omnibus, whether it's any kind of congressional bill that's supposed to hit the House, the Senate, and then go up to the president to get vetoed anyways. They can't even read these things. This particular omnibus was something like 4,000 and some pages. I mean, look, Man Economy and State was 1,600 pages, and it's full of complex economical ideas, and it might take you a couple months to actually digest, right? But these people, and they put all of this, they slide, like we've been listing off all of these radical thefts that they do from us because they print this money, it degrades our dollar, which is an inherent tax that we just don't see, right? But they put all of this pork in there, and then they rush it through in the Christmas season where all the politicians are like, oh, I just want to go home to my family, so let's just rubber stamp it. And this is what we get. We're now at the point where, like he said, it's half of what they bailed out the big banks. This is where the radical libertarian sphere really gained hold, was when they bailed out the big banks. The idea that too big to fail started, that became a thing that was entered into the ethos. There's no such thing in the market as too big to fail. That is a market function. When something fails, if it's not providing the consumer with what it needs, it takes massive losses, and eventually it goes under. You don't get to just steal money from poor folks and redistribute it to the 0.01% of the world. But that's what we're doing. And in 2008, they said that was going to save the economy. But all they did was kick the can down the road. And here we are now, in just one part of this omnibus bill is half of what they spent. And they had to have lobbyists. They had the Occupy Democrat movement. They had all of this husk and fervor about whether or not they were even going to be able to make this happen without popular revolution. And it came awfully close. And coincidentally, you have intersectionality and radical racial politics and identity politics introduced into the polity at the same time. You can check the numbers of the corporate press reporting on racism, bigotry, transphobia. The numbers shoot up after 2008 because everybody said, fuck left and right, fuck distinctions of culture war. These people are stealing we are the 99%. We are the 99.9%. And we need to team up against these people. So whoever they are, the deep state, the CIA, whoever comes up with these brilliant psyops, they injected radical ideology into the polity and divided us more than ever. And here we are, some 15 years later, and we're spending this on a regular basis. That's just a piece of this bill.
Right, that's about the size of it. Going back to the debt clock time machine, just as a real quick number. In 4 years, the interest on the debt is going to come to $1.5 trillion. That's going to eclipse our spending on war. In fact, it will almost eclipse that on Social Security. Only by 200 billion will it fall short of that. And it will be within striking distance of Medicare and Medicaid put together. By that time, it's projected U.S. federal spending, just officially, will be almost $9 trillion annually, with a budget deficit of $1.8 trillion. And the actual federal spending, 9.8 trillion. And the actual deficit, figuring in, of course, all the other things to figure in, 2.21 trillion. With the gross domestic product being only 28 trillion, almost $1 in $3 will go to the federal government in that year. Almost 1/3 of the economy would be controlled by the federal government. There are socialist states that are more private than that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's this, I forget who said it. Per Byland. He's a Mises fellow, I believe. He's a great libertarian thinker, and he posited on Twitter within the last few days that we need to quit referring to this as a free market society, because and he's absolutely right. What part of this is free? What isn't taxed, regulated, or outright illegal? The fact that the money printers are monopolized by the state. This is why I say we need a radical revolution. I don't see a political solution for this everybody who runs and has any amount of power in the federal government, they run on increasing the tax burden, increasing the federal spending, increasing the debt. So, it's there's nothing free. Yes, we have a market. Markets operate in spite of all interventionism. So, sure, we have a market, and black markets operate better than this. But I mean, what can you say? There's nothing free about these markets.
Because of government intervention, some of those black markets turn into red markets. And speaking of red markets, I want to personally congratulate the drugs for winning the war on drugs.
Yeah, facts. Facts. Yeah, this entire thing is it should be eye-opening, you would think, to some folks. Like, not only are they stealing from you directly by way of taxation, but they're stealing from your kids. They're stealing from your kids' kids. And it's like I said yesterday, none of this is sustainable. They can inflate the currency and manipulate the interest rates all they want. Modern monetary theory is bunk. This can't go on forever, because if it could, well, why do we have debt at all? Why don't we just print the money? Why don't we have a universal basic income and we just print it and hand it out? Why do they stop at $15 an hour minimum wage? Why not 100? Why don't we just print money and hand it out? Because at some point there is a negative that is visible, it's tangible, right? So why would we head in that direction at all? If it's, I mean, it seems logical to me. I mean, what are your thoughts?
It's a law of economics that if it can't go on forever, it's going to stop. So at some point, we're going to hit the wall. The only question is, at what point do we hit the wall? Zimbabwe hit the wall, and that was quite a disaster for them. The Weimar Republic hit the wall. Venezuela hit the wall. What they really want to do is see how far they can push it without hitting the wall, because they know that if they do, bad things are going to happen. And in Venezuela, they almost had a revolution. Zimbabwe completely fell apart. And Germany actually elected Hitler. So they want to see how far they can push it, how much bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal wrote of the Caesars, they can fund before the laws of economics finally come back to bite them in the ass. They have a number of court intellectuals, these tame economists who were produced basically on assembly lines at the Ivy League schools. Paul Krugman and all his acolytes, all the establishment dudes who write for the New York Times and all them, they try to camouflage this. They write articles saying that nobody expected inflation to happen when
except for the Austrians predicted it. Ludwig von Mises predicted this before the fiat was even a thing.
That's exactly the problem. They have these court intellectuals try to disguise it, but you can't, no matter how many articles you write, ever change economic law. You can't bend the law of nature. You can't bend the law of man. You can't bend the way people interact with each other. It's the way that human action functions. The certain things are just a priori true. And no matter what you do, no matter how much force you apply, no matter what schemes and what incentives you introduce, you cannot change certain things. There are some behavioral economists out there that think that everything is plastic, everything is malleable, that human nature can be molded like Play-Doh. I'm thinking about Stephen Levitt. I'm thinking about Dubner. I'm thinking about that deplorable Cass Sunstein. I'm thinking about all of them. It's very naive to think that just everything, all of human nature, can be manipulated like it's putty. It's the height of hubris. It's a fallacy that only political power could engender. The court intellectuals are essentially jesters. They're people that try to distract the king of Babylon. It wasn't Nebuchadnezzar, it was Belshazzar, yes, who saw the writing on the wall, but continued to party away the night, until the Medes and the Persians came and slew them all in the night. That's what the court intellectuals are doing. They're just keeping up a show. They're putting on camouflage. They're trying to distract people. They're trying to distract the populace, and they're providing a convincing, nice array of papers and books and other things to make the ruling class feel like they're constantly secure in their power, that they can keep, and the ruling class I'm defining just for the purposes of definition as the state and the people who are involved in the administration of it. We're talking about the upper bureaucrats.
The central bureaucracy, correct.
Yes, they want to make sure that they feel comfortable, that the plebeians will never find that there's something wrong, that we'll never see the man behind the curtain. That's us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the it's really the I mean, I hate to sound partisan about it, but it is the progressives who created this social constructionist view of humans. In that way, if, like you're saying, if humans are infinitely malleable, then they can be molded in the way of the state would like. And this is where we're at today, especially when it comes to cultural issues, let alone the fiscal policy. I honestly believe, though, that all of this stems from the degeneracy of the power structures that we live under, and specifically the fiscal policy. Because if you can eliminate the idea of time preferences from people, then it's like you said yesterday, it encourages and incentivizes moral decadence and degeneracy. And I mean, look around, what do we see? Decadence and moral degeneracy.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what happens when the government creates regime uncertainty by seizing stuff, by plundering everyone, all plundering all, Bastiat again. When there is no property rights, or there are property rights existing in name only, then people are not going to feel safe to invest. They're not going to feel safe to associate. They're not going to feel safe to do anything. They won't even feel safe to labor to the fullest extent. And as a result, when people don't even feel safe to do these things, they're going to take a greater premium on what they already have, and they're going to be more risk averse. And this creates a malaise. And the malaise is a self-reinforcing thing. We see this all across the Western world.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on? Any topics? Did you want to see anything else in the Festivus report here?
I think we hit all the high marks.
Okay.
That was good.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you coming on, man. It's good to have somebody to bounce dialogue off of. I know we have some minor differences, some would say large differences. I mean, it's potato to potato to me, but I appreciate your time, and we'll certainly be doing this again shortly. I appreciate you.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me again.
Yes, sir.